A pilot actually crashed while trying to show off for his passengers, and it was all caught on camera, but wait until you hear his side of the story. Let's check it out.
I thought it might be easier if I could just go live and answer a few questions for everybody and what I recall and how it went.
I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Now, it's very rare to have a plane crash caught on camera, but it's even more rare to have the entire thing filmed from the inside. Now, thankfully, everyone survived this, but there's a lot of lessons that we can take away from it, so let's start at the beginning. Now, this is the pilot, and this is his wife, and they're good friends with this other guy and his family who just so happen to be YouTubers, and this is actually their first time flying on a small airplane, but listen to what the pilot says before they get in the plane.
Chad, do you promise to take care of us?
I promise.
Chad, do you really think it's okay?
I promise you. I would never do something that would be even remotely dangerous.
Now, I like what he said because that's the right attitude to have. You want to try to keep things professional as possible, even if you're flying with friends and family. Unfortunately, he does end up doing some pretty dangerous stuff on this flight that we're going to talk about, even though it wasn't necessarily intentional. But for now, his pre-flight looks pretty normal, although one of the passengers is busy saying his final farewells.
If I don't make it, and these are my final words, just know I love everybody.
That's pretty ironic, and maybe he really did feel that way and he really was afraid to fly, but honestly, I think he's just trying to create a little drama and tension for his YouTube video, obviously not knowing that they're actually going to crash. Now, the airplane that they're about to go fly in is a Cessna T210M Turbo, also known as a Cessna 210 or a Turbo Centurion, and it's kind of like a flying SUV because it has 6 seats and you can actually fly it with 6 people on board. Now, it's really stable and it's good for instrument flying, but it can feel like it's especially heavy in the nose unless you have some weight in the rear. And the other thing that you need to know is that the plane has retractable landing gear, which is also going to play a role in this. They're taking off from Roosevelt Municipal Airport, and they're going to fly around these Uinta Mountains here and head back down this canyon when they're done. Now, we can see in the video right here that they only have about 30 gallons of fuel when they take off. So even with 6 people on board, they're probably about 300 or 400 pounds below their max gross weight. However, it's August and it's about 75 degrees Fahrenheit and the field elevation is just over 5,200 feet, so the density altitude is probably around 7,200 feet, and they're going to fly around the mountains, which are at an even higher elevation. And we've talked about density altitude before on this channel because your aircraft isn't going to perform as well at a higher elevation on a warm day, especially if you're heavyweight. So that's something the pilot should definitely be thinking about and making sure they have enough airspeed and altitude to remain clear of the terrain. But listen to what he said.
We headed up that way and then we were going to come down Moon Lake, which is a big reservoir down one of the canyons. And I've done it lots of times. It's a beautiful flight, and
this is where complacency might be a factor because even though he may have done this flight lots of times before, perhaps on those flights it was just him or just him and his wife, so this might actually be his first time with a full passenger load, so they're probably going to be at a much heavier weight than what he's used to. The takeoff and the flight up north is pretty much uneventful, but then they start heading south and they start flying down this canyon, and listen to what he says here.
Anyway, we were coming down the canyon and I had plenty of speed and I was plenty high enough.
All right, I shouldn't have to say this, but you don't want to make an Instagram video trying to explain what happened when you're the pilot involved in an aviation mishap. And I'm just not sure what he hoped this video was going to achieve, but you heard him say that he thought he was plenty high and he had plenty of speed. But it certainly doesn't look like that in the video because this looks more like what I used to do flying low levels in the Strike Eagle. Basically just trying to stay low to terrain mask and avoid simulated enemy radar sites. Now the biggest difference is that I would be doing that at 480 to 540 knots ground speed, and he's definitely not.
And I put my flaps, 1 notch of flaps down, and put my landing gear out to slow me down so that we could descend closer to the lake. And
this is probably one of the biggest mistakes that he makes, and I'm just not sure why you would do that. It's a warm day, you're heavyweight, you got high density altitude, you're just putting yourself in a square corner. You don't ever want to put yourself flying low and slow in a canyon unless there's a runway in the middle of it or you're trying to do an emergency landing. Now, when you're going fast, like I would be in the Strike Eagle, you can just trade that airspeed for altitude and get climbing away from the rocks in order to troubleshoot any sort of problems that you have, especially if you lose an engine. But he doesn't have that option in his Cessna. Now you can see the hills on either side of him, so if he does have an engine malfunction or a bird strike, you can see he doesn't really have anywhere to go but right in front of him because he doesn't have that airspeed to try to climb up and troubleshoot. But listen to what he says next.
And we were descending anyway into Roosevelt where we were going to land.
Now this is the part where I think he's just trying to cover for himself, because really, how far away from the airport does he really think he needs to be to start descending to land? Now I know pilots don't like trying to do trigonometry while you're flying, so an easy rule of thumb you can use is just take your altitude in thousands of feet and then multiply it by 3, and that's how many miles out that you want to start your descent. So the canyon, it looks like it's about 33 miles from the airport, so he should be about 11,000 feet above the ground. Or if we take into account the elevation difference between the mountains and the airport, he should really be about 8,000 feet AGL. Basically, you don't need to descend to 500 feet when you're 30 miles from the airport, but my guess is he's just trying to help out his buddy, maybe try to get some cool video footage for his YouTube video, and unfortunately, this is where things really start to fall apart.
So I had my gear down and one notch of flaps in, and when I came around the last corner over the lake, there was a lot of wind, of headwind. I immediately went to throttle up a little bit to speed up. I was at like 22 inches of manifold pressure, which is a little over like half power at this time. And when I pushed the throttle in, there was just nothing.
He's low, he's slow, and he's about to lose an engine, and he's got nowhere to go. Now in that scenario, you don't really have a lot of time to try to come up with a game plan, so this is where you really have to rely on your experience, assuming that you have enough of it, or you have to hope that luck is going to get you through it, or some combination of the two. Now before we see what happens, I know some of you are going to say that it's easy for me to sit here and just criticize everything that he did, because we weren't there, right? And we don't know how we'd react in that type of situation if it was us. But let me just say that this is the whole point of a pilot debrief. You get to remove the stress and talk about what could have been done better, so that way you or someone else doesn't make that same mistake again. Now in the fighter jet community, the debrief is sometimes longer than the actual flight itself, because we're going to sit down and we're going to watch the playback of the flight to capture as many learning points as we can. And in a minute, I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that this guy actually did right. But as pilots, you have to put your ego aside sometimes if you're going to learn in the debrief, because mistakes can have deadly consequences. Now let's see what happens.
Jack, quit it!
Just, I promise, just relax. Stop.
First of all, did you hear one of the passengers tell him to quit it? Probably because they think this is some sort of joke or something. And his response is kind of muffled, but you can tell that he does the right thing because he says something like, I promise, relax, stop, something like that. And basically, this is trying to just get them to be quiet so that way he can focus on the problem. The next sound you heard was the landing gear warning horn, which is going off because he retracted the gear as soon as he realized he had an engine problem, which was a really good decision because your best glide speed is based on a clean configuration because you want to have as little drag as possible. Now he said he did this because he wanted to make sure he could make it to the beach or the hillside just beyond, because that's going to be a much better option than trying to land in the water. And in case you're wondering, it's only about 50 seconds from the time that he realizes that the engine is failing until they crash. So there's just not a lot of time. And this is why if he was at a higher altitude, he could take some time to maybe troubleshoot the engine problem. And I think you're starting to see why being low and slow in a canyon just isn't a great idea. But listen to what he said he did next.
As soon as I realized I had enough speed to get across the lake, I put my landing gear back down to start slowing down to find somewhere to land.
All right, there's a few things he could have done better here. Now, first of all, one of the things that he never talks about is getting to his best glide speed. So we don't really know what airspeed he's at. But this is super important, and the pilot's operating handbook actually shows you the best glide speed based on your weight, but that's assuming that you actually have the time to figure all of that out. Now, in a no-time situation like this, that's why all of the engine failure procedures that you can see here reference 85 knots. You should just have that number memorized because that's also going to be your landing speed for a forced landing. You can see right here kind of splitting the difference based on your flaps. The reason the speed is so important is because it's going to get you as far as possible, like when you lose your engine and you need to make it across a lake. Now, he also said something that was pretty interesting, and I guess he felt like he was going too fast, so he decided to lower the gear in order to find a place to land. But in my opinion, you want to have your landing spot picked out before you lower the gear. And the other problem with lowering the gear is that the checklist for a forced landing says you should keep the gear up if the terrain is rough or soft. So I guess this is a judgment call, but I would consider a beach to be soft, and I would consider that sagebrush covered hillside maybe to be rough. So I'd probably leave the gear up, but that's just me. Now he ultimately decides to land on that sagebrush flat, and here's why.
The beach had a lot of people on it, and I was really scared that if I landed on the beach that I might endo and flip over frontwards. I've seen that happen a lot on soft beaches. And so the best scenario I thought was to land in the sagebrush.
Now I can understand his logic with the people on the beach because you never know where some kid might be playing and you don't really see them. But remember earlier when we talked about how flying the 210, it can feel a little nose heavy, but that's usually when you don't have any weight in the back. So he's talking about flipping over, and he's probably just not thinking about how he has passengers to kind of counteract that. And honestly, if he was afraid he was going to flip over, then he should have left the landing gear up like the forced landing checklist tells him to. But ultimately, he's committed to the sagebrush, so watch what he does next and pay attention to the sounds that you hear.
Okay, we're gonna land. Hang on tight, we're gonna probably flip over. Okay, gears down, flush down. We're gonna get going real. Hang on tight, guys. Okay, be good. Everybody relax.
That tone that you heard is the stall warning horn, and that's going to go off when you're about 5 to 10 knots above your stall speed. Now the POH you can see here has published stall speeds, but they're for a very specific weight, center of gravity, configuration, bank angle, stuff like that. And that's because they've determined that in those conditions, that's when you're going to exceed the critical angle of attack. And that's really the only thing that matters, because remember, you can stall a plane at any speed. All you have to do is exceed the critical angle of attack. However, based on their configuration and weight, the stall speed that they have is probably closer to about 55 knots, and if that stall warning horn is going off, he's probably only doing about 60 to 65 knots. And remember that the best glide speed for a forced landing is 85 knots. But listen to what he said about this.
So I started slowing it down as much as possible I would pull the nose up and it would get real close to stall, and then I'd push it over and pull it up because I didn't have enough room to go around and come back and land. So I had to get slowed down enough to land in the sagebrush flat, and I wanted to get as slow as I possibly could just before touching down to minimize the crash, basically.
All right, look at this image. This is what's out in front of him, and they actually end up crashing right around here. So you can see he has plenty of room to just hold his best glide speed until they land. But it's almost like he's committed himself to the fact that they're going to crash, so he just kind of forgets about flying the plane, and instead he's trying to go as slow as possible, which is extremely dangerous, and you're going to see what happens in a second. Now honestly, I think he just got really lucky, because one of those times when he pulled back to the stall horn, he could have easily just stalled it right there and they would have spun into the ground and probably died. And this is why you just want to fly your best glide speed, and if you need to slow down, you can do a forward slip, because that way you can keep your airspeed where it's at, but you're basically creating extra drag by exposing the aircraft to the relative wind, and that way you can lose altitude much faster. Also, there's something else that's really important that you need to consider here. Listen to this part again.
Okay, we're gonna land. Hang tight, guys. Hang on tight, we're gonna probably flip over.
He does a good job of telling the passengers that they're going to land and to hang on tight because he thinks they're probably going to flip over, so at least he gives them some sort of a quick safety briefing, but this could have been a lot better if he had just said something like, buckle up, unlatch the doors. Buckling up is going to help them a lot more than trying to hold on tight, especially if they do flip over. And the reason why you want to unlatch the doors is because, first of all, the checklist tells you to do it. And that's because the doors don't provide a lot of structural integrity to the aircraft, but they can get jammed very easily when you crash land, and you don't want to find yourself surviving the crash just to die inside the burning wreckage because you're trapped inside. All right, now let's listen to his assessment of the crash, and then we're going to take a look to see what really happened.
When we got just above the ground, we were able to put it down right as it stalled, so we did fall just a little bit down. They said that my skid marks go for about 10 feet.
We're gonna get going real. Tight, guys. Okay, you good. Everybody relax. It's gonna be hard.
Now, in my opinion, based on the height of the trees, it looks like he stalled when he was about 50 to 75 feet in the air, and they just dropped like a rock. And that's kind of consistent with the passenger injuries, and it's also probably why the skid marks were only about 10 feet long. But overall, everyone lives, so you have to give the pilot some credit because you don't know how you'd react until you're in that situation. However, there's definitely a lot of lessons that we were able to take away from this, and if you enjoyed this debrief, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.